So,
Yeah, thank you very much.
sorry if it's strange or difficult for you.
Is there sugar in here?
There is sugar in the bag of sugar, which is somewhere around the place.
Oh yeah, one front right. So I'm just used to seeing it in that white container.
Yeah.
That's true. Now, how many people have not had a booklet yet?
Is it a new sheet, is it?
No, it's still the same one. So the one that we've got goes up to chapter 23.
I'm okay then.
Or should do. We're only going up to 14 today, so if you don't have one, here's one. Some of them are green. Sorry about that. We absolutely digest printer paper.
That's not. Some of them were pink a few weeks back.
Yeah. Here's a couple more. Ida, do you need Ida?
Ida.
Ida. Do you need one?
Thank you. No.
Ich habe das Milch.
Kann ich bitte die Milch haben? Almost. Very
I'm on Duolingo at the moment for German.
The thing is, I thought she was American.
Oh no, Annika's accent is just very good.
I thought you sounded like Kira. Yeah. I decided you were American and suddenly you come out in fluent German and then completely like thrown me. Maybe I'm both now. In German, sometimes you put if you've got two verbs, then you put the second one at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a bit.
That is just unfair.
Thank you.
It's the sort of thing languages do just to trick you and make sure you always feel uninitiated.
German is tricky,
To be fair, I think English has got to be the worst one though, hasn't it? We just changed the numbers back.
People seem to pick English up. Yeah,
I think English is easy to get started with and hard to get perfect.
Yeah.
Whereas I think more logical language like German and Spanish is more like once you know the rules.
Yeah, Portuguese is quite logical. Even Germans can't speak Germans correctly.
That's true.
Oftentimes.
What?
Edith von Dati, oftentimes stop us around.
I was doing one the other day which was about saying sorry. So there's one that's, what is it? Es tut mir leid?
Yeah.
Which means it's all my fault, basically.
No, it's still, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, but that's what it literally means.
It
like,
does.
each word for word.
It does mean whoa.
Yeah.
Something like that.
It's all my disaster. But then they just made up another one which is really long and German sounding just for fun. Entschuldigung. Like what?
That long.
Which means excuses.
Yeah, and definitely that's a typically German way of saying it, isn't it? It's like we make saying sorry easy because we say it a lot, but they don't say it much, so they don't. They don't need like a.
It seems more sincere.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah.
Like
You can also,
I'm really sorry.
But you can also just say sorry. That's
Sorry.
Sorry. That's just like on the street. You're like, sorry.
Could someone pass me the coffee, please?
Britain's victory. That one is empty.
That one's empty.
All right, should we make one more before I go live? I've got about 4 minutes, so I'll come back with that.
I'll start it for you.
Thank you. I expect you walking in on a heartfelt prayer.
They're different ones. You could do a multinational one. That is the
Yeah, separate in tongues.
Yeah, with the fudge one. I don't really know. Don't like ginger. Yeah, I think I'm gonna. Don't like ginger. I don't like ginger that much, like if it's in tea or something. But I had that one before. And it's very spicy.
Oh, I love that. But I'm not eating it.
Well, I was way last week. Which page are we on now?
That's strawberry.
Yeah.
You're both on different. Oh, no, you are. Which page? What page are we on?
Started at 7.
I'm doing another
Yeah.
crate today.
Page 13.
It's my turn.
No. I thought
When we say around page 14.
I'm going to curry master when I go back to Germany.
Right, no, I was in the north of England for conference for days.
No, my parents disconnected from me from Germany. Thanks.
Nothing was important, they just forgot to work.
You want all of my clothes? What is wrong with you?
Can I learn your names while he's making coffee?
Oh, I'm Ida.
Ida,
Bruna. Bruna.
Maruna,
Yeah.
Annika.
Deepa,
I'm Anthony. I'll marry you both from Friday night.
yeah.
I'm Chris.
I'm Ruth.
Tracy. And Catherine.
Just everybody on a head.
I've almost forgot already.
Ida,
Yeah,
Maruna,
Alrica.
I got something for you.
Oh my God, sorry.
It's from Sally.
Right.
Hello.
You know.
Are you watching it live?
All right, welcome everybody. We're going to begin. Oh, could you get that door shut when you go for it, please? Sorry for anything you see or hear that's going to confuse you at all. I'm still getting used to the live streaming thing. So we are on our way through Isaiah as it stands. We've looked at it as literature, we've looked at it as scripture, we've looked at it as theology, we've looked at it as archaeology. We've tried to decode it, and we found that it offers basically a challenge wherever you want an answer. So what we're doing is we're going through it a piece at a time. I've divided it in your booklet into 12 acts, which are almost like a theatre thing, almost like Shakespeare, where you get a new set of characters that will all talk to each other and proclaim things about each other and sometimes speak on behalf of God, sometimes wrongly or presumptuously, and sometimes on God's authority. And then they'll kind of be summarized and then melt away back into the background again. So last week we studied Isaiah 1 to 6, and would anyone be willing to share their kind of main takeaway from that first segment of Isaiah as it stands?
I wasn't there last week.
Well, fine, fair enough.
But I caught up on the first 5 chapters.
You missed the best one, which is chapter 6, where we see the court of God and Isaiah's commission. What we found through Isaiah's... Hello, you have to grab a seat. Welcome, welcome.
Morning.
Squeeze in wherever there's space. There might be some chairs out in the hall. What we found in 1 to 6 was that Isaiah was standing kind of at the crossroads of history. And when the scene 1 begins, Israel, as it stands, is 2 nations really, one larger northern kingdom and one smaller southern kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. And it's big trouble because on the horizon, apart from there, you have the great kingdom of Assyria, which is mobilizing for war. So we noticed it in what's called the Middle to Late Bronze Age, the period that's sort of 1000 to sort of 800 BC. There was a substantial kind of collapse of, actually it was a bit earlier than that, more like 12 to 1500 BC. There was this big collapse of very large kingdoms. So Egypt and Sumer and the great kingdoms that were the big empires in the beginning have all sort of died down a bit, and in their place has emerged all sorts of pocket kingdoms. So Israel was one like that, as a strong city surrounded by a large piece of countryside. And what Assyria is doing in around about 700 is it's gobbling all of those up. So it's got a huge army, they're very well equipped, they're very well trained, they're very ruthless, and they basically march into a small kingdom, tear it to pieces, deport most of the people, ethnically cleanse it, sow their own people inside of it and call it an Assyrian province. When Isaiah starts to write, that's what's happening. So all the small kingdoms around Jerusalem and Judah are being digested by this enormous Assyrian empire. And what Isaiah says to everybody is, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, this is the deal now. David's line, David and Solomon's kingdom, united Israel as a kind of regional power, is over, basically. The future will be, we will be living by God's permission as a teeny-weeny piece of another empire, which will be so powerful we couldn't ever hope to defeat it. And in Isaiah's time, that's all in the voice of Assyria. As it turns out, that pans out true for the subsequent conquest by Babylon, then by Persia and the Medes, then by the Greeks, then by the Romans, all the way up until the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So Jerusalem, as its, David's kingdom, is over, Isaiah proclaims. This is the end. There is still hope, there is still promise, there is still God intervening on behalf of the people, but Isaiah sees the future, which is that Israel's going to live as a subset of a larger kingdom, basically forever. Now in chapter 7, we start to see the machinery of that process work out a little bit. We're going to be introduced to a bunch of kings of neighboring kingdoms who all kind of try and gang up against each other or unite or pay off Assyria or stand up against Assyria or bribe Egypt, and this will happen throughout the book for the rest of it. And some of the place names and people concerned are very confusing. I'm going to do my best to try and help you with times and places and people and things, because as a 21st century Christian, often we look at them and we're just really confused by what we see. You know, we have no idea who this guy is or where he came from or what his role is in the text. We can see a great deal of the text that the New Testament shows us very clearly a messianic interpretation which we automatically kind of take on for ourselves, but a lot of the rest of the material, apart from the stuff that seems to be obviously about Jesus, it's very confusing. So what we're going to try and do is understand those 7 chapters, 7 to 14, in their context, and talk about the messianic things which are very clear about them as well. Any questions or things to say before we start?
In terms of prophecy,
Yeah.
in chapter 2,
Chapter 2.
verses 2 and 3. Basically, what the prophecy that he mentions, obviously, is prophesying about something in his time,
Yes.
but it's a prophecy that actually continually being made true currently, because people are visiting Jerusalem. It's talking about people from all over the world will visit
Yes.
Israel. Even now, tourists from all over the world go to visit Jerusalem.
Absolutely, yeah, and they have been doing since this.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. So what we are doing is we are looking at Isaiah with a particular kind of interpretation, or what did we call it? Begins with H. Hermeneutic. We are looking at Isaiah with a particular hermeneutic. It's basically a pair of glasses that we've created which continually colour our vision. And the colour that we're colouring it with is the idea of multiple fulfilment. So we looked at Isaiah 55 in some detail in the first week, and we talked about how rain and snow in the water cycle comes down, it waters the earth, it flows to the sea, it evaporates again, it goes back up to clouds, it falls back again as rain again, and it cycles. And God says through Isaiah that that's what his word is like. It doesn't go back to God empty, but it achieves everything for which he sent it. And so when Isaiah speaks to his context, sometimes to his past, sometimes to his immediate future, sometimes long into the future, Isaiah is speaking something different to what we would normally call, analysis. He's not just commentating on them. He's speaking on the authority of God about them. And when he does that, this biblical prophecy can come true in many ways. So we will see some particular prophecies about children who show up throughout chapters 7, 8, 9, and 11, and 12, and 13. And what we will be doing is we'll mostly be thinking about Jesus, because we're Christians mostly in this room. And the New Testament authors take it and make it very clear. So they say, this is what Isaiah said would happen. But Isaiah was writing about a circumstance 7 centuries previous to Jesus, which obviously no longer existed at the time of Jesus. But the New Testament writers were able to say, look at what has happened. Now when I look at Isaiah, that's all I can see is this prediction ahead of time that this thing would happen. And they do that deliberately as a complex act of interpretation. But you've been used to it for so long, it seems like obvious sense to you. But that is why the rest of Isaiah seems so confusing. So the stuff that the New Testament writers have already interpreted, you think of as straightforward, and the stuff that they haven't touched or like only alluded to, you won't know unless you go in deep and study about Assyrian kings in the 7th and 8th centuries BC, which people don't normally do, which is fair, isn't it? So Isaiah 2 is a good example. They'll all come from all nations, and they'll all say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and give praise to the God of Jacob. And the prediction there, where the weapons will be turned into tools, farming implements. Our swords will go to plowshares, our spears to pruning hooks, and we won't have to train our hands for war anymore because it'll all be over. Isaiah can glimpse, remember like rowing a boat? He's looking around his environment. He's saying that one day there will come a time. He's looking over his shoulder at the future, and he's saying there's going to come a time where war and weapons and generals just won't be useful, because there'll be a kind of everlasting peace that comes from Zion, which affects all the nations, not just this nation. So we can look at that in the 21st century and say, oh, look at that. This is still coming true right now. People still going pilgrimaging over to Israel and still going up to Mount Zion and still praising God and still praying and still looking forward to this day where the Middle East won't be inundated with sectarian conflict of every description. One day, Egypt and Assyria and Turkey and Arabia and Iran and all of the different groups may one day finally be at peace. But we can look at that in the 21st century and say, wow, boy, has that not happened yet or what? We're definitely still looking forward to that day. So you can see that the rain comes down and touches Isaiah's environment. And then a few hundred years later, something else happens. And everyone's like, oh, this is this again. And then maybe in the future, something else happens and everybody says, this thing that's happening right now is that. And we should not shy away from that process. That's not taking the Bible out of context. That is interpreting it according to our experience in a very fair way. And it's what the New Testament writers were doing. They were allowed to do it. So are we. Might not be correct if we do it badly, but we have the right to be able to interpret the Bible. We have to... Christians as a whole, we hold to the belief that everybody can have a real living connection with God. And if the word is God's, then the interpretation can also be his. So Peter in the New Testament, he warns us, doesn't he? No prophecy ever came true because of people's own interpretations. In the real cases, people spoke as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. So for Christians, this is a mystical and spiritual experience, not just an analytical one. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Let's turn our Bibles to Isaiah chapter 7. And before I read the portion of our booklet, which is on page 14, begins Act 2, I'm just going to pray. Father, I thank you for everything that you have given to the world and everything that you have given to us here in this room. Thank you for time in all of its complexity and all the different people and places and things that have made human experience so rich and so beautiful. Thank you for everybody who followed your call faithfully and is calling on your name even today. And Lord, we acknowledge you, we acknowledge your Bible in this moment, and we ask for the eyes of our hearts to be open so we can understand what is written. We don't want to look and only see mysteries, Lord. We want our understanding and our awareness of you and what you do to be more full, more rich, more accurate, so that we can proclaim you to everybody more faithfully. Lord, even as this broadcast goes out to every continent, I pray that your word would touch the hearts of people reading and listening and watching and those who are here in this room in a way we can feel, so that we can be more attuned to your purpose in our lives. Amen.
Amen.
So thanks once again to the Prayer House Ministry of Caffeine who have sponsored our coffee and snacks today. I'm going to read from this booklet first, and then we'll get into the text as quickly as we can. So the second act I've called Gently Flowing Waters. It contrasts heavily with the first one. First act of Isaiah begins chapter 1 and 2. I hate all your religious feasts. I can't stand all your somber assemblies. You got iniquity in your hearts. You're just like all the other nations. You hate me and everything I do. I'm going to destroy you. That was sort of chapters 1 to 5, wasn't it? And then chapter 6, Isaiah somehow has this vision. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and he's transported to this incredible experience where he sees God on his throne, and he says, well, I've seen God, that must mean I'm going to die. And then he has this thing that happens where an angel takes a coal from the heavenly altar, burns his tongue, and says, see, now you're made clean. And you have to go on behalf of heaven to many peoples and nations and languages and speak what God tells you to speak. And by the way, nobody is going to listen to you or agree with you. So you're not going to appreciate it while it's happening, but everyone else will after you're done. And we found in our introductory session that there's a kind of Jewish historical record that says Isaiah, son of Amos, was killed by being sawn in two by the religious people of his day who did not appreciate what he had to say. And we're going to discover what I really want you to see this session, the thing I want you to take away is the split within Israel of people in Israel and Judah and Jerusalem who wanted David's kingdom back online, and people in Judah and Jerusalem who were listening to Isaiah saying, this is something we've just got to accept. Okay, so in Isaiah's time, they're going to take the form of a pro-Assyria lobby with Isaiah, who says, look, we can't stop this. God has already said that he's going to do this. We have to get on board with God's plan and just accept it. But the anti-Assyria lobby say, how can this possibly be God? These are vile, murdering psychopaths. You know, they make the pogroms and the Nazis just look like babysitters. You know, these are crazy, terrorizing, massacring hedonists. They are here to destroy everything we value, so we have to fight them. And we know that Israel and Judah have already split off apart from each other so far, don't we? But within Judah, there's even going to be these splits. And within the kingdom of Israel, there's going to be these splits where factions try and win supremacy by currying favor or standing up against Assyria. Okay, so the second act is where Isaiah begins to be a sort of chronicle. It keeps track with the major events of Israel's history as they develop under the reign of King Ahaz. So it opens up and it says, well, now Ahaz is on the throne, which is around about 750 to 735 BC. In the region, the major power is still wielded by Assyria, an all-conquering bunch who are particularly violent and prone to ethnic cleansing. Isaiah's main message from God to Jerusalem is not to fear, because God will deliver them decisively from Assyria, even though all others have failed so far. So basically, the deal is, Assyria is a large kingdom. It looks at a small kingdom on its frontier and it says, I'm going to take that over, and then it does. That's how it's gone with this long list of territories around Assyria up until now. Israel and Judah are next at this time and place. So scene 1, which we'll kind of say is the first 2 chapters basically, chronicles the Syro-Ephraimite War, which is historically recorded in the Taylor Prism and the Oriental Prism and the records of Sennacherib and Tiglath-Pileser, which we looked at before. And Jerusalem's status is definitely clear and present danger. So Jerusalem's not being attacked by Assyria yet, but it will be. And it talks a lot about sons and signs, which for Christians are particularly important texts. Scene 2 kind of goes beginning of chapter 9 to the end of chapter 10, and we're looking at the final defeat of the northern kingdom of Samaria. With the Assyrian siege against the capital city. This is another thing which is recorded in history. This is verifiable historical archaeological fact. Assyria laid siege to Samaria, took over all the lands around it, and from then on afterwards, there's basically no northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrian province of Samaria is sort of seeded with Assyrian settlers. And the reason Jewish people hate Samaritans in Jesus' time is because of this historical event where Samaritans were sort of forever mixed with the nations around them, and they were seen to be irredeemably so. There's a big word against Jacob. This is Isaiah sort of sounding the death knell for the northern kingdom. Scene 3, end of chapter 10 to beginning of chapter 12, where God guarantees the future of Jerusalem. And Assyria attacks Jerusalem, and normally when Assyria attacks something, they die. In the event, Jerusalem doesn't die, and we're left with the question of why. And Isaiah is saying this because this is what God is doing. He's saving us because we're listening to him, and he's keeping his promises secure for other reasons, and that we're just the beneficiaries of it. Scene 4, 13 and 14, Jerusalem's temporary but successful revolt against the oppressor and the Babylon burden. Now, Jerusalem's temporary but successful revolt against the oppressor sees Assyria basically withdraw without conquering, and that never happens. So that was huge news for them. And Isaiah kind of looks over his shoulder on his rowing boat again, and he sees Babylon. Now, Babylon, it's a bit like, if you can imagine Britain, Assyria would be like the EU uniting against Britain to invade and attack it. And Babylon would be if the whole of Asia did it. Do you know what I mean? It's like for these local kingdoms, these small kingdoms, these are unthinkably vast resources. You know, the Persians and the Babylonians at this time are the most powerful kingdoms in the world by far, and they possess the ability to just melt whole kingdoms and cities. Jerusalem at this time is small fry. So the fact that they survived this moment of invasion by the Assyrians is almost like a introduction. But Isaiah says the main event is Babylon, which already stands under condemnation from God and is doomed for sure. But we still have yet to see Babylon in terms of Isaiah's real time. So he's saying in the future, Babylon is going to be next, and it's an all-conquering empire, and always with the word of God and with prophecy, particularly with the prophets that you find in the Bible, you see that tyrants and all-conquering empires are always doomed. And Babylon introduces us to all of that. So when Isaiah speaks, Babylon's nearly at the peak of its powers. And when the New Testament is written 700 or so years later, Babylon is already a heap of ruins inhabited by owls and jackals. So what Isaiah said has already come true. But the New Testament writers pick it up, don't they? They pick up the Babylon burden. They say this all-conquering empire that's all around us, i.e. Rome, is Babylon now. And we notice that in the same way that the Rastafarians and the liberation theologians of 100 years ago said about black slavery, they looked at white imperialism and slavery and white capitalism and imperialism, and they said, well, that's Babylon. And they were right to say that, in a way. They took the text and they interpreted it in their own surrounding, and they said, look, this that is happening to us now is that, which should warn all of us who live in such a country. Does anyone need a pen? There you go. So that's the beginnings of it. We're going to have a look at Isaiah chapter 7, and what I'm going to do is read it in small chunks and pause for thought each time. I've got some discussion starters here which will help us get going. Ahaz, who followed Uzziah and Jotham, in fact. So Jotham and Uzziah were the previous kings of Judah. Jotham was like a co-regent. So when he was born, Uzziah got leprosy and withdrew, and Jotham was still underage, so he ruled for a while. He didn't rule for very long. I think it was only about 4 years before he died, and Ahaz takes over. Ahaz gets a longer swing at the throne, and so he's the one that Isaiah focuses on during his reign. And he largely abandoned the military policy of his predecessor, Uzziah, leaving Jerusalem in a very poor position against the northern kingdom and against the Arameans. So Isaiah begins by saying an alliance was struck between the northern kingdom and Damascus, and they attacked Judah. Gosh, I'd be getting ahead of myself if I read all these bullet points. Let's read the text, shall we? So, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 1. In the days of King Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but they could not yet mount a successful attack against it. When the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of the people shook like trees in the forest shake before the wind. Let me stop you here. Some personality introductions. The house of David, we're really talking about Ahaz and his royal family here. They're the ones that are shaking like trees. Rezin, the king of Syria, needs no more introduction. That's who he is. He's the king of Syria. And he, like everybody else, is in danger of being gobbled up by Assyria. He's like on the northern edge of Israel, and he's going to be next. And the guy who's king of the northern kingdom, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, he's a really interesting character. The biblical account of this, which we might unpack later if we have time, is found in 2 Kings chapters 15 and 16. And there's some interesting information there that doesn't quite sit neatly, and has started a lot of discussions about who, what, where, why, when, and how the king of Israel was the king. It turns out that this son of Remaliah, Pekah, has basically deposed and overthrown and sort of brought up a rival kingdom to sort of say, I'm the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. So at the time it was Menaliah, who was king of Israel, and his throne and council are all in Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom at this time. But Remaliah's son Pekah, he sets up in Gilead, which is to the sort of northeast of Jerusalem. And it's the territory of Naphtali, it's the territory of Galilee, it's the area there, it's now in the modern country of Jordan, east of the Jordan River. He sets up there and he says, I'm the king of Israel. And in the end, he overthrows and deposes the real king of Israel's son and takes over. And the first thing he does is unite with the king of Damascus and they attack Judah together. He's got dreams of grandeur, this guy, and he's going to come up a lot. So Ahaz is afraid, his heart is melting, and verse 3, the Lord says to Isaiah, go out and meet Ahaz, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, which means a remnant will return. They have poetic names here, and it's very significant. So go out and meet him, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool of the highway to the washer's field. I don't need to know more. We don't need to go into that. Say to him, be careful, be quiet, and do not be afraid. Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smouldering stumps of firebrands, or at the fierce anger of Rezin of Syria and the son of Remaliah. So don't be afraid of them. They've devised evil against you, saying, let's go up to Judah and terrify it. Let us conquer it for ourselves and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Instead, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it will not come to pass. The head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, he's the king. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, and if you are not firm in the faith, you will not stand firm at all. So these two kings have got a plan. Let's conquer Judah and put our boy on the throne and we'll kind of rule as a triple alliance. And God says it's not going to happen. And in fact, within 65 years, like within one lifetime, Samaria as a kingdom is doomed. It's going to not even be a kingdom. Now, if you're a skeptic and you read this, what do you say about this 65 years prediction? If you're a skeptic, you don't really believe in miracles and things, what do you say is the reason for how Isaiah got this correct? Great. So if you're a skeptic, you say, come on, this is all written after the fact. And somebody just wheeled in this prophetic word that they wrote afterwards saying, oh, look, this lost prophecy of Isaiah came true. It doesn't hold water to me. This is Isaiah in the context of the rule of this king, and he's saying this thing that's happening is not going to stand, and it doesn't. And in the end, when Sennacherib does lay siege to Samaria, he completely catastrophizes it. It does cease from being a people. It's completely annihilated. So what Isaiah says comes true. And notice again what he's telling the king to do. What is he telling the king to do?
Believe.
Stand firm and believe and calm down, relax. This is all foretold. This is something we can trust in. Assyria is coming, and it will melt these guys like wax in front of a furnace. And when it gets here, in God's time, it'll overthrow us. It won't be the least thing we can do about it. But if we stand firm in our faith, we will stand, and God will allow us to survive and carry on being a remnant of the people. Make sense? Yeah. Great. Shear-Jashub means a remnant will return. Could this be seen as good and bad news? What I mean is, Jerusalem's not conquered yet. A remnant will return suggests there's going to be most of us are going to die one day. And it's like, wait a minute, a remnant? You mean we're not all going to survive? Oh, only a little remnant are going to survive. Oh no, that's bad news. Well, I guess it's good that, the line will be carried on and we'll keep being a people. There'll be the sort of Jewish people will survive. There's very bad news. And Isaiah's doing a piece of performance art with one of his kids, basically, to say that a remnant will survive and return, but the most of us are screwed. Pardon my language.
I would say, I think on chapter 2 or 3, that says that there'll be a remnant, otherwise it'd be like Sodom and Gomorrah. And same,
good, if God had not left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom and become like Gomorrah.
Same as with Daniel and Babylon, that if it wasn't that remnant saved, there'd be...
And we noticed it broader throughout biblical themes, didn't we? We found that the very reason there were two kingdoms was because God had already done that with them. The northern kingdom was cut off from the promise of succession, and the southern kingdom, which was much smaller, was kept. We saw it with Abraham. His clan was a lot of women, a lot of wives, a lot of sons, a lot of adopted sons. But he said, look, this is just about you and Sarah and baby Isaac, isn't it? And the same with Noah from before. We've got all sorts of people living on the earth, and they're all to be wiped out except for Noah and his descendants. God does this so that he can be faithful in what he's promised and still carry on his legacy of love and benevolence towards people. So God says, look, I have to be true to myself, so some of you have got to survive, but because you've so fully broken the agreement we made, I have to destroy you beyond recognition. I have to change you substantially into something else. And the fact that as Christians in the first century, Jesus came saying that what happened is you need to believe in me. That's how to get to God the Father. And if you don't believe in me, you won't get there. I'm the way, the truth, the life. There's no other way except through me. And people didn't like it because they said, no, come on, Judaism is standing on the promises of all this legacy of history. Who's this Messiah? We need to follow him. He's only a carpenter's son. But within a lifetime, the temple of Jerusalem is destroyed. Jerusalem itself is destroyed. The whole nation is obliterated for, basically 20 centuries. And everything that followed from Christianity was that the believers who were Jews who became Christians became the first sort of stub of the church. All the people who wrote biblical books, with a couple of exceptions, were Jewish believers. They're all Jews in Jerusalem at first. And they go to the nations, and that's what makes Christianity happen, to say it's now no longer about a bit of dirt in the Middle East. It's now about every country, every bit of dirt, every bunch of people from Australia to Alaska and everything in between.
Which are the blessings from Abraham.
Sure, to bless all nations. The seed of Abraham would bless all nations. Good. 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles includes the account of Ahaz asking the Assyrians for help, but Isaiah doesn't mention it. Isaiah's focus is on Jerusalem and what's going to happen to it, but you could be forgiven for thinking that Jerusalem was just out there on its own. Ahaz has a direct line of communication with Assyria. And in the event, what happens in the end is he goes to Assyria and he has a look at their little altar and sacrificial place, and he has a replica made in the temple of God to the Assyrian god. So he sells out big time to Assyria, and I don't think that's quite what Isaiah means. So Isaiah's kind of not saying Ahaz did a good job, but he's saying that definitely the plan of the others to overthrow Judah is going to fail. Okay? So, verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz and said, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz says, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Sensible Ahaz. And God said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to wear out people, that you must also weary my God? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, because before the boy even knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord is going to bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. In that day the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the streams of Egypt, and whistle for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will both come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and upon the thorn bushes and the pastures. And in that day the Lord will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria. He will shave the head and the hair of the feet and private parts, and will sweep away the beard as well. In that day a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep, and because of the abundance of milk they give, he will eat curds, because everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver, they will now become briars and thorns. With bows and arrows a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for the hills that used to be hoed, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns, but they will instead become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. So, imagine little old Dorset with all its cornfields and pasture lands. They're all very carefully hedged and very carefully roped in as sort of being particular people's property. That's what Gilead and the Northern Kingdom look like. They're ancestral lands of great repute as farmland. And what Isaiah says is God's going to whistle, like, and there's going to come a stinging fly from the Nile Delta, and there's going to come a stinging bee from the Euphrates, and they're both going to meet in the middle and sting this place to death so that it becomes just wild again, completely plowed. Like the picture is very much like if you let hogs loose in a land, they just destroy everything. They uproot everything, they tear it all to bits, they chew everything, and once this is all left, Isaiah said this land's only going to be good for, sending your sheep to find grazing, not going to be able to get wine or anything useful out of it. Assyria is actually famous for its bees and its honey. Assyria occupies most of the land that is now within the sort of partially recognized nation of Kurdistan. Basically that whole piece sort of sandwiched between Turkey, Iraq and Syria. And their whole kind of hillside economy included a lot of honey making, and that's why it's a bee that's Syria. But the picture is very clear, isn't it? There's going to be horrible buzzing flies that come in and drive us all away and tear up all our good land. So, let me ask you a question. What is the Christian interpretation of chapter 7, verses 14 and 15? What do we do with this passage? Christ himself.
Emmanuel with God with us.
Who's the young woman?
Either Mary or the Virgin, or if it is like Jerusalem or Christians, it depends on how much you take out of it.
Okay. In the end, this is about Ahaz's son. It's about Ahaz's son. And what is being said is, before this boy is old, the enemy that you dread, the thing that you can't stand the thought of happening, is going to have already been done. The Northern Kingdom is going to be gone. The king of Assyria is going to be at our gates before the boy even knows how to choose right and wrong. Before he's eating solid food, it's going to be upon us. And obviously, it happened, and it took place in Isaiah's own lifetime. But the Messianic interpretation started with Zion being the virgin. The woman, the sing aloud, daughter of Zion, for greater are the children of the desolate one than the one who has more children. Zion is the mount of the temple and the sort of holiest holy place for the Jewish people. And the promise is for Messianic Jewish people was always that Zion would give birth to Messiah, that Messiah would come from Jerusalem, that he would stand in God's promises, and that he would fulfill these expectations of David's root and branch being restored. But the virgin aspect of it, which happened when you translated the Hebrew text into the Greek text, which the New Testament writers were using, they translated it as virgin, like unmarried woman who's never had sex, she's a virgin. And the Hebrew word is not quite that clear. It's just young woman, like young woman who her sexual status could be anything. But the Matthew picks it up and he says, look, here's God hiding a secret message about how Jesus is going to come to the world in this prophecy. So when he introduces Mary and Joseph, and he says this is virgin who's betrothed to a man called Joseph of good repute, not Moses. So they before they've got together, before they've consummated their marriage, she's found to be with child, and Joseph gets the dream from God that shows that it's from the Holy Spirit, and it's not for him to put Mary away or divorce her. And Matthew says, look, this is God hiding a miracle in advance, and here it all is coming true in front of all of us, and nobody was guessing it. No one was expecting it. The Jewish messianics of around about Jesus' time, who were expecting a David's heir to come at some point, were not expecting it to be a virgin birth. They figured it would be a royal child of the royal line, but through a normal means. So in a way, if Jesus had been born through Joseph and Mary, he still would have been a candidate. Does that make sense? But the fact that he was there before they've even consummated their marriage means that it's easier to then join the dots in terms of his divinity, that he's not just a son of David, but he's David's Lord from ages past, the fulfiller of all the dreams, not only of Jewish people, but of humanity. Any more to say or ask?
I would.
Right over there?
It's interesting about the milk and honey.
Yep.
Milk and honey, the promised land. Milk and honey for the sun before we can eat it.
And milk and honey here in the desolated land.
Milk and honey there in the desolated land.
Yes.
So much of it.
That's good.
It's covered in bright, all you're getting on desolation.
That's right. So what Isaiah is communicating is that the land will be desolated from what it currently is, which is vineyard territory, it's wine country. And what Isaiah is saying is that God is basically reverting to type. So originally this was a land of milk and honey. That's what Joshua and the guys were told in the desert before they went in, which is what you're saying. And it's like we're going back to that. But we're not going back to it in a sort of settled and lovely, idyllic sense. We're not going back to Eden. It's more like we're going back to the land just after Eden, which produces thorns and thistles for the man who has sinned. So these are intentional allusions that Isaiah is driving all the way back into deep Genesis history for the people to kind of wake them up to the seriousness of what's about to happen. So you're right to notice curds and honey, milk and honey, or cheese and honey, both for the son and for the promised land and for what will be the fate of Samaria and Gilead. It's like you're basically going to have the whole thing wiped and it's going to start all over again from the beginning, literally from the beginning. Like there's going to be no legacy of everything else that's happened since. It's just going back to the beginning. Pretty scary, isn't it?
And I'd add quickly that when we say that like scripture being recycled or reused, meaning multiple things, like it says in Proverbs 25 verse 2 that it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the wisdom and the glory of kings to search that out. And obviously, when you've got the apostles reading stuff like that they would have seen that it's all about Christ.
Yeah.
But at the time, it would have meant it would be a different prophecy coming true, but yeah.
Good. So the big joke for Matthew is that God is literally with us because his son is literally here because of the virgin birth, because of the appearance of the miraculous conception. God is here with us. The first hearers would only have thought, yeah, God is with us, like he was with us in those days, and like he was with us in Exodus, and like he was with us at this time with Elijah. What Isaiah is saying is this is going to happen, and then it does, but the living word kind of is still true and free to be kind of interpreted by Matthew when Jesus comes to say, look at that. This is a great and glorious secret that nobody was expecting. So it's wrong to say Isaiah thought he was prophesying about someone who 7 centuries later would be born as Jesus, the son of Joseph and Mary, but it definitely, this passage was locked with this secret expectation that people hung on to throughout the rest of Jewish history for sure, and still do interpret messianically. Good? All right, chapter 8. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet, write on it in common characters, that means the language that people understand, and write belonging to Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, which means quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil, or something of that sort. And I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Berechiah, to attest for me. And I lay with the prophetess, Isaiah's wife, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, because before the boy is old enough to cry, my father or my mother, the entire wealth of Damascus and the whole spoil of Samaria are going to be carried away by the king of Assyria. So here's another baby. Okay, so the first one was Hezekiah, son of son of Ahaz. If I had that right. Ahaz, yeah. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz. So that's the child who's going to be born. They'll call his name Emmanuel before he grows up, the king of Syria over there. This is another one. Isaiah has a son with his wife, who's also a prophet. Take that, David Pawson. And she has a baby, and he says, what we do is write, this belongs to the one swift to the plunder and quick to the spoil, because by the time he's old enough to say, dada, mama, it's already going to be over. The Syrian and the northern kingdom are going to be done. It's already going to have happened. So Isaiah sort of sews these into his text, these pieces of things which would have only made sense in his time. But we can also look at this as a messianic prediction from now. So we interpret this messianically too. The Lord spoke to me again, because the people have refused the water of Shiloah that flow gently, and they rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, that means the Euphrates, which is where Assyria is, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise up over the channels and go over all of its banks, and it will sweep into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching up to the neck, and even the outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. That's Hezekiah. So he says, Hezekiah, this is your land, and Assyria is going to swarm around it like a big flood. Like those pictures of the Somerset floods, where you got like one little hill with a couple of people living on the top of it, and the whole land around is flooded. That's the picture. The little Emmanuel is going to be living in the kind of hill city of Jerusalem, and Assyria is going to be all around it. And so be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. Give ear, all you far countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Take counsel together, but it's not going to come to anything. Speak a word, but it will not stand, because God is with us. The Lord spoke thus to me, with his hand strong upon me, and he warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, don't call a conspiracy all the things that these people call conspiracy, and don't be afraid of what they fear, nor be in any dread. For the Lord of hosts, him you shall honour as holy. Let him be your fear, and him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offence and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and many will stumble upon it. They will fall and be broken, they will be snared and taken. Bind up this testimony. Seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells in Mount Zion. And when they say to you, oh, inquire of a medium or a necromancer who chirps and mutters, should not the people inquire of their God instead? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? To the teaching and testimony. If they will not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry. When they are hungry, they will be enraged, and they will speak contemptuously against their king and their God. And they will turn their faces upward, and they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish. They will be thrust into rich darkness. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations or the Gentiles. The people who were walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them a light has shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, and they are glad when you divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken, as you did on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment which is rolled in blood, are going to be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this. So, let me give you the skinny summary. It's all going to go bad, very, very bad, but it's okay. There is a eternal and miraculous hope with which we can rely on God to save us. But you can't see it right now. It's like a baby. Another baby is coming. This land of Zebulun and the Galilee of the Gentiles, this is the land that was settled east of the Jordan. We've talked about this. Do you remember when the Israelites were supposed to take the land? They came out of the desert and they all wound up on the eastern shore of the River Jordan, looking west into the land. And 3 of the tribes said, well, this is good enough for us. Let's just settle here. And God said to them, like, they were allowed to settle there, but they had to send all their fighting men in to help with the conquest of the rest. And that's what happened. So part of the ancient kingdom of Israel was east of the Jordan. And that's the land that the son of Ramaliah is in control of, Gilead, it's known as now. So he's taken over this land, and because he's got this whole scheme to attack Judah, God's going to destroy it utterly. It's going to be like a place of grazing instead of a place of wine presses. But God has got a special salvation for it too. Like there's a future for it, that God's going to save them. Now, how would we interpret this text in terms of what we believe as Christians so many centuries later? What do we see when we look at this? Christ again. It's easy. The answer is always Jesus and the Bible. Our hermeneutical interpretation is seeing Jesus all over this, isn't it? Deepak, what did you going to say?
Chapter 9, verse 6, you've got the Trinity in one verse.
Chapter 9, verse 6.
You've got Jesus as Son, you've got the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and you've got the Counselor, who is the Holy Spirit.
Well, there you go. So when Jesus says there's going to come one more, it's going to be the Counselor, you often wonder whether the disciples are like, woo, we've got the everlasting Father and we've got the Prince of Peace. Turns out there's a wonderful Counselor on his way.
That our Father would put in us.
Yeah.
What?
Which must have been big news to them, because remember, they didn't have any of this. They didn't even have a real doctrine of the Trinity until, it's not really correct until you get to Athanasius, 350 or so years after Jesus. But here it is, hidden in the text for us to find afterwards and say, look, this is the common sense interpretation of this passage. No Jewish person would be looking at this thinking of that. They'd be saying, look, I know what this is. This is the promise that after the devastation, Gilead's going to experience some restoration and reprieve from God on his authority.
But it says in Peter that the angels marveled that the special Gentiles be given the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Which, they definitely wouldn't see that.
And the land of Zebulun of Naphtali, this is Galilee. This is where Jesus is from. So this is the great reprieve. So for the writers of the New Testament, they say, look at this. This is the thing that was promised. Isaiah had no idea about it. You guys have no idea about it. But now that we've met him, we totally do. And everybody should believe that this was a secret kind of hidden in the text for all time. But nobody looking at the text with a neutral eye would see that. Isn't that weird? I think it's quite staggering, really. I'm really excited about it. So, you can still go inside Hezekiah's tunnel. Hands up if you've been inside it or looked at it. One person here has. You still go in it. You can still read the inscriptions that were related to this. God talked about because you rejected the waters of Shiloah. Basically, if Assyria surrounds Jerusalem, you're going to have water. There's no good spring on Mount Zion. You're going to have to pipe it in from somewhere else in the kingdom. And that was the beginnings of what became Hezekiah's tunnel right there, which we looked at some archaeological evidence from. I'll show you it here on the live stream. Never mind. Here's the seal of Ahaz. For the people on the video stream, sorry you guys can't see it. It's what were we looking at here, Ida? Piece of pottery. Basically, someone dug it up, and it's the seal. So what you do is you melt the wax, and then you print the stamp on top a pottery seal, and it shows that it's an official royal thing belonging to Ahaz, son of Jotham, king of Judah. And they found his real one, the genuine article that's out there in a museum somewhere. So, amongst the doom and the threat, the miracle is promised that a son of David will once again be enthroned over the whole country, including Galilee and Jerusalem, under an exceptional title. So, what Isaiah said is there's going to come somebody from the line of David who's going to stand in all of this, and he's going to inherit all of this stuff. But remember that Isaiah's only just got done telling everybody not to hope in Jerusalem and Judah sort of becoming a mighty kingdom. Look, we've got to get used to being a sort of subset of someone else's kingdom. That's what God's done because of our breaking of his covenants. So even though we're going to be under Assyria and then whoever knows who else, we have to keep this promise that one day they'll become the heir of Jesse, the root of the branch of the root of the stump of Jesse and David. And obviously as Christians we look at that and we go, I know who that is. But that's hard for us to talk to Jewish people about. It was hard for the guys who wrote the New Testament. Most Jewish people routinely and roundly rejected this very message. They said, no, that's not what this is about. In the first century, Christians were utterly the minority of Jewish people in the world, and they still are. Out of Jewish people in the world, Christians still make a teeny weeny little sliver of Jewish people, and partly it's because of this textual difficulty, because the Christians are looking at stuff in Isaiah and we're saying, look at it, here it all is, obvious, plain as day. And the Jewish people are saying, no, it isn't. It's not there. You can't see it. So if you talk to a rabbi or a Jewish person who's sort of deeply religious, they will likely not agree with our interpretation of these texts. They won't say that this is what is promised. They'll talk about the 8th century and they'll talk about a future messianic hope, but for them that just isn't the case.
Same as with Saul and Acts and all the multitudes, like one stoning and killing because he's blaspheming.
Yeah.
But he wasn't, he was delivering the truth.
But everybody thinks it's blasphemy until afterwards. They thought Jesus was doing it, and now afterwards we say he's not. So, any more questions or things to say on scene 1 here? That's 7 verse 1 to 9 verse 6 segment. Let's move over then. This one's a briefer section, middle of chapter 9 to middle of chapter 10. We called it a word against Jacob. It starts off against where God says in 9 verse 8, says the Lord has sent a word against Jacob. Let's just read it together. The Lord has sent a word against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel, and all the people will know that Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, who say in pride and in arrogance of heart that the bricks have fallen, but we will build with dressed stones, and the sycamores have been cut down, but we'll put cedars in their place. Basically, although we've suffered a defeat, we're going to rise up and be even stronger. The Lord has said to them, the Lord raises the adversaries of Rezin against him, stirs up his enemies. Again, we're talking about Assyria. The Assyrians on the east and the Philistines on the west devour Israel with the open mouth. For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. The people did not turn to him who struck them, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts. So the Lord has cut off from Israel the head and the tail, palm branch and reed, all in the same day. The elder and the honoured man is the head, and the prophet who teaches lies is the tail. For those who guide this people have been leading them astray. Those who are guided by them are swallowed up, and therefore the Lord does not rejoice over their young men, and he has no compassion on their fatherless or widows, because every one of them is godless and an evildoer. Every mouth is speaking folly. For all this his anger has still not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. For wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It kindles the thickets of the forests, and they roll upwards in a column of smoke. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is scorched, and the people are like fuel on the fire. None of them spares each other. They slice meat on the right, but they're still hungry. They devour on the left, but they're not satisfied. Each devours the flesh of their own arm. Manasseh devours Ephraim, and Ephraim devours Manasseh. Together they are against Judah. For all this his anger has still not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. So This is that thing that I was describing earlier, where the northern kingdom has kind of two competing factions, the pro-Assyria and the anti-Assyria lobby. And God's saying, look, all they're doing is eating each other, making it easier for Assyria to just sweep them away in the end. No, none of this is going to help you. Standing up for it is not going to help. God's anger is not turned away, and you're just going to have to suffer it.
I have one thing.
Yeah.
That's what I believe, and if I'm wrong, please someone show me.
Mm-hmm.
But in verse 12,
Mm-hmm.
17,
Yeah.
and 21, it mainly at the bottom of each bit, it talks
Yeah.
about and his hand is still stretched out.
Yes, that's right. So it comes back and it comes back
But
and it comes
that's
back.
also Christ.
So his hand is not turned back. What do you mean?
It says, because it often, and in Revelation, it says that often in the Old Testament, it would always be like God's, his right arm or his arm stretched out,
Mm-hmm.
and then in Isaiah 53, the beginning of it says about that his right arm stretched out as the Messiah is Christ.
Okay.
And then it also says like in Revelation, where that Christ is at the right hand.
So he stretches out his arm.
So my interpretation.
Okay.
So
That's good. So the right hand of God is something we're used to as Christians being used to describe Jesus. And so what is here being manifested as wrath and fury against injustice is also part of the identity of Jesus. So Jesus in chapter 3 of John, for instance, he says, look, God loved the world like this. He sent his one and only son, so that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. But through the rest of chapter 3, he says, by the way, if you don't believe, the wrath of God is still hanging over you. This is the way out. It's me. But if you don't, then it's wrath and fury from God's right hand. Isaiah did this earlier in chapters 2 and 3. He says, the hand that used to offer a blessing is now coming down to smite you. And it's like that God's hand is still God's hand, but he does multiple things with it, sometimes to chide and discipline, and sometimes to provide and bless. So, yeah, good point. Any more things to say about that little section from chapter 9? Okay, let's move on then. So chapter 10, up to verse 23. Woe to all those who decree iniquitous decrees and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that their widows might be spoiled and that they may make prey of the fatherless. What will you do on the day of punishment in the ruin that's to come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave all your wealth? Nothing but remains but to crouch amongst the prisoners or fall amongst the slain. For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. So you can see this poetic device that Isaiah is bringing back again and again and again. He says, even though it's this bad, it's getting worse. Even though it's this bad, it's getting worse. And what is God really talking about here? Why is he angry with Israel? Is it because of a religious covenant breaking, or is it something else? Yeah. How is this ungodliness manifested primarily?
Don't listen to what he says.
That's not really what he's talking about, actually.
He's talking about the rulers making bad laws.
Good. Good. So we've got the weak in society and we've got the strong. The law of God is possibly the most benevolent ancient code towards the weak in existence, at least in terms of the ancient world. So there's huge protections, legal and material, for people who are poor, people who are fatherless, people who are widows, people who are disenfranchised, people who've lost their property, people who've owed great debts. The law of God is actually very merciful towards those people. There's continuous provision for poor people, even to the point where your personal property, you need to maintain it in such a way that if poor people are in the neighborhood, that they'll be able to find food. So the gleanings law, which we looked at when we looked at the book of Ruth particularly, Ruth follows the harvesters, and things they drop on the floor, she picks them up. You could say, well, if I was a harvester, I'd probably be looking behind me going, oi, I'm coming back for all that. But in the law of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, literally says you mustn't. You have to let people do that because people need to eat. And it's wrong for you to go well-fed and have a great harvest if there's people in your country who are dying of starvation. There's many, many other protections like that, even to the point of neighborliness. So there's a great law we looked at in Deuteronomy where if your neighbor has a tree with fruit on it, you can pick it. You can pick some and eat some, but you can't bring your basket or your box and harvest it. That would be wrong. That would be stealing. But to take a little pluck off of a neighbour's vine is something we should be able to give to each other as neighbours. That's the idea. And what God is saying is, this is what you've betrayed. Your iniquitousness is manifested in social unfairness, where the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, and you've ended up taking widows and fatherless orphans almost as your prey. You basically squeeze the last drop out of them to make more for yourself. But what are you going to do with all that wealth when the Assyrians ride in? It's going to be lost for sure, and then you'll wish you had just shared it instead. Interesting. Verse 5, woe to Assyria. Now here's something. This is a really, really interesting section. So what Isaiah's been saying all this time is you have to let Assyria do it. There's no other way. God has judged us, and he's just using Assyria to accomplish his purpose. And it's a bit like, get on with it, France. The Americans are going to invade. You have to let them so that the good can come. But then God says, well, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the stick I'm hitting you with, bad stick. The staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I will send him, but against the people of my wrath I command him. To take spoil and seize plunder, to tread them down like the poo in the streets. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think, but it is in his heart to destroy, to cut off nations, and not a few of them either. For he says, are not my commanders all kings? Is Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus? In the same way my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols whose carved images were greater than those of Judah and Jerusalem and Samaria. Shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols the same as I have done to Samaria and her images? So what the king of Assyria says is, I like smashing stuff. I'm good at it. I'm good at smashing kingdoms, and I'm good at smashing gods, and I'm good at beating up idols and tearing down religions. I do it a lot. Look at all these ones I've already done it to. Jerusalem, Samaria, these are just next on the list. There's probably going to be more after them. That's what he says. But God says, literally, this is like a stick or an axe in my hand, and I'm hitting you with it. And when I'm done with it, woe to the axe, because it hit my lovely country, so I'm going to destroy it.
God raises up there, doesn't he, as an army, like Nebuchadnezzar and
Yeah,
Egypt.
he clarifies this position now. He says, does the axe raise itself above the one who swings it? No, it's the one who's doing the swinging that's doing the work, but the axe, he can do with it what he likes. He can chop you one day and burn the axe the next. So when the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and his boastful look in his eyes. For he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I've removed all the boundaries of peoples and plundered all their treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples. In the same way one collects eggs that have been left behind, so I have gathered all the earth. There was nobody that moved a wing or opened the mouth or chirped. It's like I'm raiding the baby birds in the nest that are defenseless and abandoned. But shall the axe boast above the one who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against the one who wields it, as if a rod should wield himself over the one that lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who's not made of wood? Therefore the Lord God of hosts will send a wasting sickness amongst the stout warriors, and under his glory a burning will be kindled like the burning of fire. The light of Israel will become like a fire, and his Holy One a flame. It will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day, the glory of his forest and the fruitful land. The Lord will destroy both soul and body, and it will be as when a sick man wastes away. The remnant of the trees of the forest will be so few that a child could write it down. Let's stop there. So God says, Assyria is my tool, my weapon, my thing that I use. This is an absolutely scandalous theological idea. Remember that the people of Israel, people of Judah, are used to the idea of a king setting himself up against God's appointed plan, right? So we've got Pharaoh in Egypt as our main example. And when Pharaoh doesn't do what God wants, God smites Pharaoh. And all of Pharaoh's plans fail. So he tries to go back on his agreement 10 times, and God just sends a worse and worse plague every time. Finally, when he relents, Pharaoh plans to go back on it again, and God strikes it down as well, drowns all the warriors in the Red Sea, and makes the land desolate, because God can do that. He's on our side. But what God says is, now you're not on my side, my country, my people. And so I have to judge you like I judged Pharaoh. You're the bad guys now. So I'm going to destroy you, and the stuff I've got to work with are other ungodly kingdoms. So I'm going to bring the most powerful one against you, and I'm going to save you in the end. But it's going to be bad. So in that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but instead will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. For the Lord God of hosts will make a full end, as decreed, in the midst of all the earth. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people, the ones who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they strike with the rod and lift up their staff against you, as the Egyptians did. For in a very little while my fury will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. And the Lord of hosts will wield against them a whip, as when he struck Midian at the rock of Horeb. And his staff will be over the sea. He will lift it in the same way he did in Egypt. And in that day his burden will depart from your shoulder, his yoke from your neck, and the yoke will be broken, because you have become so fat. He has come to Aiath. He has passed through Migron, and at Michmash he stores his baggage. They have crossed over the pass. At Gebar they lodged for night. Ramah trembles. Gibeah of Saul has fled. Cry aloud, O daughter of Galim. Give attention, O Laisha. O poor Anathoth. Madmenah is in flight. The inhabitants of Gebim flee for safety. This very day he will halt at Nob, and he will shake his fist at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Behold, the Lord God of hosts will lop the boughs with terrifying power. The great in height will be hewn down, and the lofty will be brought low. He will cut down the thickets of the forest with an axe, and Lebanon itself will fall by the majestic one. So, repetition in Hebrew and Israelite poetry, Middle Eastern poetry, is usually for emphasis. What is the emphasis here? What keeps coming up and coming up and coming up?
Sounds like in chapter 2 and 3 how the
Destruction.
basically, destruction of people, but the land that things would get taken away from them. Woe to them for not doing what God said.
Yeah. Verse 8 of chapter 9, the Lord has sent a word against Jacob. What do you think is the best way for us to understand the word here?
So like which chapter?
Chapter 9, verse 8. The Lord has sent a word against Jacob, and it's going to fall on Israel. What is this word? Does it just mean the text of this prophecy?
Wow.
Anyone?
Does the word
Share some feelings. What do you think it is?
Probably the fulfillment of that word too, right?
So not just the word, but the fulfillment.
Yes, because if someone would just say these things and they don't come true, then
That's not worth anything.
yeah.
Good. So it's not only the text of this prophecy, but it's also the power of the fulfillment. So definitely this is all going to happen, and this is why it's important, because it's a word from God. It's not just like an idea or a poem. This is a real thing that's going to happen. So considering its repetitious nature is all about destruction and pain and severity of it, we have to accept that somehow, scandalously, this is what God is going to do. I mean, is this what we tell people to say? I mean, now that Jesus has come, has God stopped doing things like this
No,
with nations?
not at all. Because look at the book of Revelation.
Sure.
It and it says in chapter 15 of Romans that, that some of the things that happen for stories to explain. And there's nothing new under the sun, like in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 9. Because people never listen to God, they never learn from their own mistakes. And He's just, and so there has to be punishment, but He has made a way out.
Okay.
And
All right. So, how should I look at the geopolitics of the 21st century? Within my lifetime, China has gone from being an impoverished large Asian country to the second power of the earth and is growing at a tremendous rate. Britain has been passed in most ways of counting it in the power rankings by probably 3, perhaps 4 countries. And the world is changing very, very quickly.
But there isn't one nation of God anymore.
Good. So what God says is, I'm seeing all nations more or less equally. Does that mean if a nation turns to righteousness, that God will bless it, and that if they turn away from righteousness, that He will curse it? Is it that simple?
Deuteronomy 28.
You think so? So if you do what's right, I'll bless you, and if you do what's wrong, I'll curse you. Is that how it works? So how come all the most Christian countries are most of the worst ones?
Because we're looking at tribulation, because darkness hates the light.
So it's not the only thing going on, is what you're saying. All right. So if I see China's rise, and I assume because it's important, the Bible must have something to say about it. Can I have anything more than general things about nations from the Bible?
You could say that God raises up a nation to do His work, maybe overthrow or punish another nation.
Okay.
And then He can do away with the nation that He's raised up.
Okay, so sometimes it's about God allowing something to exist, and sometimes it's about God decisively acting, intervening to break the pattern. So Assyria's pattern is unmitigated success in barbaric conquest, military annihilation, and ethnic cleansing. So they succeed, they get to Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem throws itself on the mercy of God, He says, all right, I'll hold the king of Assyria back, and He does. Now, if something really unusual happens in the world of geopolitics today, should I assume that it's God that's done it by an intervention, or should I be looking for something like that? Is this something that would be reasonable to ask myself to expect from the EU, from North America, from Africa, from Asia, from Australasia, from South America? What am I looking for?
I reckon so. I might be wrong, but it's just what comes to mind. But like Nineveh, they repented for like 40 or 100 years,
Okay.
and then went back to their ways, and then there was just destruction.
Okay.
The rise of China, is it coincidental or is there something?
I'm not going to answer that right now.
So the Christians are growing in numbers, huge numbers in China.
That's true.
Is that a factor or not?
Sure.
So China being blessed because of what's happening, are people turning to God because of their God's blessing China?
All right. So there's more than one interpretation.
Yeah.
And even in Isaiah's time, a word comes against Jacob. This is Isaiah's one, but he's already spoken about loads and loads of other prophets that are prophesying the exact opposite. They're all saying, let's rise against Assyria. God's on our side. It'll be like Joshua again and David, where he has military triumph all the time. Let's stand up against these obviously evil people, and definitely God will give us victory. And Isaiah's one saying, nah, don't bother. I wonder if we could hear that from a prophet today, or whether we're accidentally too sure about what sort of things we're in favour of.
Well, you're testing the prophecy and discerning whether it is from God.
Okay.
God's will.
And how will I know until it happens? Because Deuteronomy says this is how you'll know if someone's a prophet, because what they said comes true.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then I didn't say it. And if it does, then I did.
Yeah.
God's hedged his bets well on that one. Sorry.
When at the start of the chapter they were writing unjust legislation and things are just being torn downhill, you know that's not from God, it's not his heart.
Okay, good. So if you are committing horrible sins as well as the people you hate, then you shouldn't expect that God's going to bless what you're doing just because you like him more.
But every country does things that aren't good, right?
That is true.
So there's not one that.
Good. So if no countries are righteous and no countries are perfect and no countries have an untarnished record, which I have no doubt is true, then can any of us expect God's decisive intervention in the name of what he values? Or is it like that we're all just pawns in his chess game and he's moving us and doing things to us almost without our knowledge or say so, that he's just moving his pieces and we just have to get on with that? You know, can we hope for a intervention on behalf of our country?
I reckon so, yeah.
Think still, even though we're iniquitous?
And if I think if any nation, whether it's this nation or any other nation, if it was more godly and more prayers were given, the abundance of blessings would be so obvious, but people are so worldly, just don't care.
Well, maybe, but there are countries where people are very spiritual and they offer such blessings and prayers all the time, and those countries are in an absolutely terrible state. So we have to balance the things that we can be sure about God and the things that we can be sure about geography. And we have to interpret our scenario without giving into the desire to just say, well, who really knows? Because the thing is, the message of the cross, the message of God intervening through history, the message of the Bible is watered down mostly by us saying it's so complex we can't hope to understand it. Or it's so early we can't possibly know yet. Or it's so vague that it could mean anything. When Christians start talking like that, people start to say, well, their message is of no consequence. Because the ones who say it's all about, pick a couple of hot eggs, the ones that say it's all about gay marriage and abortion, if all of us just stop doing gay marriage and abortion, God will bless our country again, are the same ones who are looking the other way when we're selling weapons to godless people who are crushing the poor and the weak and the disenfranchised. Then should we expect that is the case, or is it right to? The thing is that when people sound really sure, I get really worried. Because I start saying, oh, you're really not sure, it's that simple actually. I think there's probably more than one thing going on here, and it's probably harder to tease apart than just that. Human ethics is about much more than marriage or abortion. And the fact that these two are the only things that people will kind of stand on two sides of a fence about means that they're very divisive. But in the context of poverty and inequality and global conflict, terrorism, those are quite small pieces of the pie. They only affect a teeny minority of people. So it's hard for me. Yes?
Repeating underlying message of this. My people come back to me, says God, everything will be okay. You're not making it by material stuff, you're not making it by your land or your power. It's all about God.
Good. So, do I need something more than my material geographic reality in order to persuade me of the truth of God and his gospel? I need something much more substantial. I cannot hope in my mortal mind to understand everything that God is doing with the kings and nations of this world, I don't think. Not in real time. I've got no chance. What I can do is put my hope in a reality which is beyond my experience of material things, and say that's where my real hope is and that's where my real reward is. I have to somehow disconnect myself from my experience in society. I have to say it's more than just whether or not I'm wealthy, more than whether or not I'm well, more than whether or not my church is growing or my country's got a government of a political party I like. It has to be more than those things, because those things will all come to bits at different times and places and circumstances, won't they? Sometimes we feel like we're the good guys and we're winning, and sometimes we feel like we're the bad guys and we're winning. And sometimes we feel like the good guys and we're losing, and sometimes we feel like we're the bad guys and we're losing. And as a British person, I have no trouble at all saying that every one of those things has come true in the last 100 years. Clearly and obviously. So, Isaiah says it's got to be more than just us. It's got to be more than just the promised land. You know, God can do this. He will do it. It is already underway. Certainty is definite. But the future is not one country out of however many. The future is all nations. The future is everybody. Sort of disconnect from your circumstance so that you can experience a new degree of freedom and hope from God. One that's not just about whether or not you have a good harvest, but about everlasting things. 10:24 to 12 verse 6. Let's move on. I have actually read to the end of chapter 10, haven't I? So I'm going to carry on. Good. So chapter 11. There will come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. A branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips, and he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion is going to eat straw like an ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand down on the adder's den. But they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord in the same way the waters cover the sea. In that day the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for all peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time, to recover the remnant that remains of his people. From Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. Stop there. So we're Christians, we look at that and we're just like, Jesus, it's Jesus, it's Jesus, it's Jesus. Look at this. Some people even say this list at the beginning, the fruit, the Spirit will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, counsel, might, knowledge and fear of the Lord. That's the sevenfold Spirit of revelation, they say. Interesting. I'm not entirely persuaded, by the way, but I think it's an interesting one. So we get that there's someone coming from the root and stump of Jesse's line, and he's going to come and usher in such a different time. So we're no longer going to be thinking about just Israel, just Judah, just Jerusalem. We're going to be thinking about everybody. We're not only going to be thinking about all the people, we're also going to be thinking about all the animals. There's going to be an end to that kind of Darwinian sort of survival of the fittest, things eating each other and the most powerful preying upon the most weak. They're going to have them all lying down in a little nest together and cuddling and being perfect. This is such a clear picture of what Christians later have sort of developed into a kind of doctrine of heaven, that somehow the great struggle will be over, the great competition of life for resources, for reproduction, for a safe place to be. It's all going to be over. The war will be over somehow, like permanently, when this person comes. Yes?
I don't know how I should say it, but obviously, is it like another multiple thing from like verse 6 and 7,
Mm-hmm.
where not only that you have like the meat-eating animals would be vegetarian and not but you also think it'd be like when it mentions the bear in Russia, other animals would be other like nations that they won't war anymore, there will be peace.
Sure, so we give some of these names to other animals, and we're not talking about just lions and leopards and adders and stuff, but maybe we're talking about specific countries. We can interpret them that way as well. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that what is being described here is a heavenly state of being where everything God hopes for comes true. But it comes via a disaster again. So why is Jesse a stump? It's because the axe has chopped the tree down, right? Like you had a great tree, the royal line and heritage of Jesse and David and Solomon. So they're a great sort of tree in Jerusalem. They're hanging on. The descendants of David are still on the throne, but the axe, Assyria, is going to come and chop it down. And when it's chopped down, everyone's going to say, "Oh no, it's over. The great dream is gone, and there's no more hope for us." But in that day, a little branch is going to grow up, a little Nazarene.
Yeah.
Growing up from the stump. And the exiles have returned. Notice at this time there aren't any exiles. We're not exiled yet. They'll come from Africa, Asia, Europe, the islands and coastlands. They come from everywhere. They're going to be restored into Zion. That's happening with Jewish resettlement, sure. But what is being described here is the supreme rule of the King of Zion. And I think it'd be much more naturally Christian to interpret it as saying that Christians will come from every nation and people be redeemed from every community, such as we are now. We come from 4 continents, don't we? We're already very representative of all of that. So, in that, said the root of Jesse. Chapter 12. No, I haven't read the rest of verse 11, have I? 11 verse 12. He will raise a signal for the nations, and he will assemble the banished of Israel, and he will gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim will depart, and those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, and neither will Judah be harassing Ephraim. But they will swoop down upon the shoulder of the Philistines in the west, and together they will plunder the people of the east. They will put out their hand against Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites will obey them. The Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching breath, and strike it into 7 channels. He will lead his people back across the river in sandals, and there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that remains of his people, as there was for Israel when they came up out of Egypt. You will say in that day, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for though you were angry with me, your anger has turned away, that you might comfort me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid, for the Lord God is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the deep wells of salvation, and you will say in that day, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds amongst the peoples, proclaim that his name is exalted. Sing praises to the Lord, for he has done gloriously. Let this be known in all the earth. Shout, sing for joy, O inhabitant of Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. So it'll all be undone one day. There'll be a great day of rejoicing and happiness. By the way, when the Jewish exiles did return from Babylon, when was that compared to when Isaiah's writing now?
Like 1947.
Like how far away is it in years? So Isaiah's writing at the time of the Assyrian attack against Samaria, which is about 700 and some odd BC.
Yes, it's about 2,700.
I mean, when the exiles returned from Persia under King Cyrus, how far away is that? Is it in Isaiah's lifetime? No. Isaiah's right around about 700. The destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of Babylon is around about 587. So about 120 years into the future. And the return from Jerusalem is 70 years after that. So we're looking at about 300 years into the future. 200 to 300 years. So about, if we look backwards that far from where we are now in the 21st century, we're talking about European colonialism. Aren't we? We're talking about 1700, French Revolution, that kind of thing. It was a long time. This is Isaiah laying it down here when we've got Assyria at the doorstep, but Babylon hasn't even raised up yet, and he's about to stand in condemnation of Babylon. He's about to say, look, Babylon, boy, you guys are doomed. But Babylon hasn't even emerged as a threat yet against Israel, certainly. Maybe Assyria thinks about Babylon and thinks, boy, that eastern edge is a bit annoying because there's a large kingdom and powerful nation on that side. I'm going to keep gobbling up teeny-weeny kingdoms to my south and west, but Babylon's there at the side, ready to mount a serious threat to my sovereignty. And Isaiah sees all of this, and he sees the time for the return of exiles and the establishment of the heavenly kingdom, but he can't see the timeline. So sown in all of his text is all sorts of speech about those things, but it's actually kind of hard to look at and tease apart. These acts and scenes kind of help us a bit, but it's actually, he's got stuff in there that comes true at his time, 100, 200 years in the future, 700 years in the future, today. We've got all of this kind of standing on these texts, and that's why Isaiah is so compelling, because of all the prophets, it's the most substantially like that. He's so, in the document of Isaiah is such a long piece of history that you can see it unfolding over 300 years or so, that it's hard for us to ignore it. It's a bit easier to ignore Jeremiah, because Jeremiah very much only really writes about his own lifetime and the lifetime after his. It's all over with in less than 100 years for Jeremiah. But Isaiah sort of is scanning several generations of believing Jewish people and several hundred years of the most interesting phase of Middle Eastern history, or one of them. And he's speaking to all of it.
But for us, like skeptics, that would just give more freedom that, that it's not like it was in his own lifetime, he could just foresee it looks like that's what's going to happen. It's hundreds of years after, and so, which just, for me, it shows that obviously God's hand is over it, and it is true. That's obvious.
Yes, and notice that your starting position is what matters. So if you're a skeptic, all of this just reinforces the sense that Isaiah was written retrospectively and that it's not genuine and it's all a work of fraud. Like, it's all just added to and added to and added to and updated with each bit of history. And what started out as a prophecy against the East India Company of 1700 is then sort of added to a chapter about Victoria. Maybe you add a chapter on the First and Second World Wars and the financial collapse in between, and the 50s and the Cold War, and you just keep adding sections until you get to the end. And if you're a skeptic, you just see that. You look at Isaiah and you see that. And if you're a believer, then you see, come on, this is proof that prophecy is real, proof that textual writings hundreds of years in advance can predict with astonishing detail the unfolding of several centuries of human history. So I'm afraid it's that's what you have to look at. I would say to the skeptic that the sowing of ideas and terms into this, which so completely did come true within hundreds of years after Isaiah wrote them, which aren't in the sequence, they're not bits added on to the end. We're here in chapter 12 and 13 seeing it. I would say that is the strongest argument to say, look, Isaiah sees this all at once, and he maybe doesn't even know the whole sense of it, but by now we can see that it was an accurate foretelling of what would take place. Any more questions or things to say? 13 verse 1 to 14 verse 2, the Babylon burden. Isaiah sees the swift end of Assyria, but in these times, like end of the 7th century BC, Sennacherib sacked and defeated Babylon and installed his son as a puppet king there. And yet the poem is condemning Babylon. So Sennacherib is looking to his east, he sees Babylon, sees, wow, that thing's going to be trouble, and he attacks it and defeats it, and installs his son as a puppet. So Sennacherib is not afraid of Babylon in a way. He's already defeated it. So why is Isaiah saying the judgment's coming against Babylon? There's also a sort of heavenly courtroom setting where three people are having an argument. God is calling an army to battle. This is all far in advance of the great Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, which is more than 100 years later. And it anticipates the humbling of Babylon by the even more distant, unbribable Medes. Does history repeat itself, or is Isaiah seeing this thing in advance? So Isaiah not only in this text says woe to Babylon, woe to Assyria, but he also sees the Medes on the way behind them. So if you imagine looking east, there's the land of Assyria over there. Beyond that, the kingdom of Babylon, the land of Babylon in between the rivers, and then beyond that, the land of Persia over there, the Medo-Persians. And Isaiah predicts that there's just going to be this continuous westward expansion by these. So first the closest one's going to have a go, and then the next one, and then the next one, and it's just going to go on like that. So Isaiah can see this. This is what he predicts. And I think that's astonishing. Let's go. So from 13 verse 1, an oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah son of Amos saw. On a bare hill, raise a signal, cry aloud to them, wave the hand over them for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. The sound of tumult is on the mountains as of a great multitude. The sound of an uproar of kingdoms, the nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land, from the ends of the heavens. The Lord and the weapons of his indignation will destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. Therefore all hands will be feeble and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them, and they will become in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces will be aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not give out their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. And I will punish the earth for its evil, the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind like the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble. The earth shall be shaken out of its place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in its day of his fierce anger, and like a hunted gazelle or a sheep with no one to gather, each will turn to his own people, and each will flee to their own land. Whoever is found is going to be run through. Whoever is caught is going to fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed into pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered and their wives raped. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver, and they don't delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men and have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, that glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will become like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. They will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Not even an Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there, but wild animals will be there. Their houses will be full of howling creatures. Ostriches and wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers and jackals in the pleasant palaces. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. So that is the Babylon prediction. He then goes on to the restoration of Jerusalem, and Israel's remnant begins to taunt Babylon. I'm just going to read it quickly so that we've done it on the video before everyone has to go. So, for the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and he will again choose Israel, and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the people will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land, as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors, and rule over the ones who oppressed them. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and your hand service with which you were made to serve, you will pick up a taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, and the insolent fury ended. The Lord has broken the staff of wicked and the scepter of rulers that struck down peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is now at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypress trees rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up to chop us down. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all you who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all those who are kings of the nations, and every one of them will answer and say to you, you've become weak like we are. You've become like us. Your great pomp is brought down to the Sheol, and the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God and set my throne on high. And I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. And I will ascend above the heights of the clouds and make myself like Most High God. You are brought down to the Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who will see you will stare at you and ponder over you and ask, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities and didn't let his prisoners return home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in their own tomb, but you are cast out, away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those you pierced with the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. You are not going to be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your own land and slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers never more be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with its cities. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off Babylon, name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. I'm going to make it the possession of the hedgehog. The pools of water I will sweep with the broom of destruction, says the Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. As I have purposed, it will stand this way. I will break the Assyrian in my land, and I will on my mountains trample him underfoot. His yoke will depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. This is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of God of hosts has purposed it. Who will annul it? His hand is stretched out. Who is there to turn it back? In the year that King Ahaz died came this oracle. Rejoice not, Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken, because from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. The firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy will lie down in safety, but I'm going to kill your root with famine, and your remnant will be slain. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes out of the north, and there's no stragglers in his ranks. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of the people find refuge. So Isaiah sees the swift end of Assyria, but in these times Sennacherib sacked and defeated Babylon and installed his own son as the puppet there. Yet the poem predicts not only the destruction of Babylon, but also the destruction of Babylon by the Medes and the Persians and the future that comes through there. Just as the death of King Uzziah marked the end of the first act, so remember it said in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up and trained his throne. He ends this act with, oh yes, and then Ahaz is dead. So the death of Ahaz marks the end of the second act, and now Hezekiah will be king. And this is the final death knell for the Philistines. So Philistines at this point are obliterated and their kingdom becomes no more. You never really hear from them again, ever in history. They're actually kind of lost to history in a lot of ways. It'd be nice to hear more from our archaeology about them, but we will have to wait till someone digs the right hole. That's it for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, and may you be blessed on all of your endeavours. We will see you next week for the next portion, which is going to be 15 up to 23. So we're going to do about 8 chapters next week, God willing.
That's strange. So the first week we did 6, and then 7 last week.
A lot of the other sections are... Oh, sorry, it's only up to 21, actually, so it's only 6. So read one a day, and it will be more fun for you when you do it. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Can I just say chapter 13 is very similar to like chapter